to show that what's happening in Texas is not an isolated phenomenon. And I'd like to suggest that I agree with all of my fellow panelists up here. Facts matter, elections matter, and engagement matters a lot. Several years ago, as Paul mentioned, we faced a similar situation in Minnesota. In May 2003, our state legislature repealed the state curricular guidelines in the social studies and directed the State Department of Education, or DOE, to produce a new set of academic standards. We had just elected a new governor, a Republican named Tim Pawlenty, who appointed a commissioner of education who was a native Minnesotan, but who had worked in the Bush administration and was at that time in the Virginia state DOE. This commissioner came to Minnesota and created what she called a citizens committee, which was actually a hand-picked group of parents, including homeschoolers, mostly private school teachers and administrators who were not bound by the standards, business representatives, and Republican Party political operatives, but not a single professional historian. In just 3 weeks, this committee wrote a set of social studies standards that was filled with factual errors and omissions, and yet at the same time required a level of detail that was very burdensome and allowed for very little flexibility on the part of teachers. I think tellingly, the document lacked any sort of introduction or explanation of its logic or guiding principles, but the political and cultural agenda that underlay it was obvious nonetheless. For instance, the U.S. history standards of this 2003 draft mentioned the contributions of slaves, as it put it, but didn't mention slavery as an institution at all, or its impact on American society and politics. It listed the Mexican-American War only once as an optional example of U.S. westward expansion. And the world history standards omitted any mention of Latin America altogether after the Aztecs. So, one of the standards that I, as an early Americanist, found most surprising was the standard that required students to, quote, recognize the significance of the founders' 4 references to God in the Declaration of Independence. Well, I taught the Revolutionary Era, and I didn't know what the relevance was, what the significance was of these 4 references to God in the Declaration of Independence. But as one of the standard writing committee members explained, in his understanding, the Declaration's description of God as a supreme judge, as the creator of nature's laws, and as the provider of the protection of divine providence, actually foretold and mandated the Constitution's separation of the federal government into the judicial, legislative, and executive branches. I thought this was very interesting. Isn't it? Yeah. Well, this was not history as I and my colleagues recognized it, and it wasn't simply a Western Civ approach or a core knowledge approach, which is what we expected, but it was, as Mark described for us, a very specific, particular, fundamentalist Christian version of the past as the unfolding of God's plan and of the United States as God's chosen nation. These draft standards, when they were posted for public comment in the fall of 2003, provoked a loud outburst all around the state from parents, public school teachers, and minority leaders from all over, and inspired the creation of a grassroots coalition that challenged both the content of the new standards and the process by which they were created. And it was coalition activists who contacted us, faculty at the university, and brought us into the fray, because we had not really been paying attention, and I think that is critical. When we got involved, the commissioner accused us of having a Hate America agenda, and her supporters proudly wore buttons that said, "Facts are not trivial." And I think that's, we didn't think facts were trivial either. It was which facts that were a question. This is a complicated story and too much to go over now, and there is a more detailed account that my colleague Sarah Evans and I published in the OAH newsletter in 2004. But to summarize, by the spring of 2004, the Republican-dominated House passed a bill adopting the Department of Ed standards. The Democratic-dominated Senate passed a bill adopting a different set of standards that was created by the opposition coalition. These two sets of standards that were just epistemologically, as well as in terms of content, dire opposites, they were merged together in a closed-door legislative conference committee that produced legally binding curricular standards that were a little better than the original ones, but pretty incoherent and very hard to teach. Overall, the whole unfolding course of events brought to mind the famous quip about how legislation is like sausage. You don't want to see either one being made. In Minnesota, politicians really made a hash of academic standards, which teachers and students were then served. Right now, the Minnesota DOE is going through the first mandatory review of the 2004 standards, but this time we have a Democratic governor, and his new Commissioner of Education created a review committee that's filled with the sort of people that I think should have been involved in the first place. Public school teachers and administrators, social studies curriculum specialists, and professional academics in the content areas. And this time I'm actually on the committee rather than shouting at it from the sidelines. As a revision, rather than an entirely new set of curricular guidelines, whatever we produce will only need administrative review before implementation. But it's not completely smooth sailing, as I found out. Disciplinary turf wars within the 48-member review committee, the budget crunch, which means no new textbooks, we can't mandate anything, make any changes that would require districts to purchase new materials, a very short time frame, and a pretty opaque process all complicate the committee's work. Our very rough first draft was just posted a couple of weeks ago for public comment, and we got lots of comments. Most of it, surprisingly, was very, very positive and very constructive. We did get a few complaints, although fewer than I expected, that the revisions don't pay enough attention to the Declaration of Independence, the free market, private property, Jesus Christ, but really not many, suggesting that the 2003-2004 approach was not so much local in origin, bubbling up from below, but really it was something that was more top-down and driven by politicians. More seriously, the Minnesota legislature now has a Republican majority, and a bill was just proposed in the House that would postpone review of the social studies standards for 4 years after the next gubernatorial election, and require approval by a vote of the entire legislature. This bill is still pending. I'd like to conclude with 2 public comments that we just got on the Minnesota rough draft that are not representative of the entire set of comments, but that are, I think, particularly telling. The first one, and I quote, is the person who wrote in said, "I am concerned about the dominance of the committee by educational professionals. Educators, administrators, etc., work for citizens through their representatives. Educators have valuable insights from their experience working with students and need to be heard. However, educational standards involve content, and there are varying opinions, particularly in social studies. It is important that those who are not professional educators have the primary role in establishing standards." And then the second comment that I thought was very telling